Most people assume that wanting attention is the default, that pulling away from it is the deviation that needs explaining. But for a meaningful portion of the population, the spotlight isn't something they're afraid of. It's something they genuinely don't want. And those are very different things. The person who deflects compliments before they finish landing, who redirects the story back towards someone else the moment it starts pointing their way, who finds their birthday quietly complicated, not because they don't appreciate the people in their life, but because the structure of the day puts them at the center of a focus they didn't ask for. That's not shyness. That's not insecurity. That's something more specific and more worth understanding. If you've ever felt a quiet discomfort settle over you the moment a room turned its focus in your direction, there's a good chance you're the kind of person who functions best when you're engaged with the world rather than being observed by it. And psychology has a compelling explanation for why some people are built this way, because people who don't like being the center of attention aren't anxious or lacking in confidence or secretly hoping someone will coax them into the spotlight. They're often operating from a very specific set of values about how attention should move in a room, and their own name rarely makes the list. Some people will recognize this pattern in themselves immediately. Others may find themselves thinking of someone they know, the person who deflects compliments almost before they've finished landing, who consistently redirects conversations back to other people, who somehow manages to be genuinely present and warmly engaged while remaining almost entirely outside the frame. This pattern runs deeper than most people realize. And it's almost always misread. There's a particular moment people in this category know very well. Someone is telling a story about you. Maybe it's a friend recounting something funny you did. Maybe it's a family member at a gathering, introducing you in a way that's meant to be kind. And all the faces in the room turn toward you at once, not with malice, not even with particular expectation, and just with that momentary collective focus. And something in you wants to step slightly out of the frame, to deflect, to qualify, to say something that moves the attention somewhere else before it fully settles on you. It doesn't feel like fear. It feels like a preference so old and so natural that it barely registers as a preference at all. It just feels like the correct thing to do. Like attention directed at you is slightly misplaced, and the most honest response is to redirect it. Most people around you interpret this as modesty. Sometimes it is, but it's usually something more specific than that. Psychologists who study how people relate to social attention have noticed something worth paying attention to. For a meaningful portion of the population, being observed closely triggers a kind of self-consciousness that genuinely interferes with natural functioning. Not in a clinical way, not necessarily, but in the sense that performance under observation feels fundamentally different from performance when the focus is elsewhere. There's an idea sometimes described as the observer effect in social contexts. The simple fact that knowing you're being watched changes how you behave. For most people, this effect is mild and manageable. For others, it's more pronounced. Being the center of attention doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it introduces a second layer of awareness, a running sense of being seen that sits alongside whatever else is happening. You're not just in the situation, you're also watching yourself be in the situation. And that doubling is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to people who don't experience it. What makes this especially interesting is that it has almost nothing to do with whether the attention is positive or negative. It's the attention itself that registers as too much. Praise can trigger the exact same response as criticism because both require you to stand still while something is said about you. Both require you to be the subject rather than the participant. The pattern appears in some very specific ordinary moments. It's possible you've had the experience of doing something genuinely well, completing a project, making something, handling a situation with real skill, and finding that the recognition afterward is almost harder to sit with than the work itself was. The compliment arrives, and you immediately look for somewhere to put it that isn't yourself. You say, "It was nothing," or "anyone would have done the same," or you redirect to someone who helped, or you find a flaw in the thing to present alongside the praise, as if the flaw will soften the focus somehow. Or maybe you've noticed the way your birthday tends to feel slightly complicated, not because you don't appreciate the people in your life, but because a birthday is structurally a day where the attention has your name on it, and no amount of goodwill from the people giving it makes that feel entirely comfortable. The moment the singing starts and every face in the room orients toward yours, something in you is already looking for the moment it will be over. Or there's the experience of being in a meeting or a classroom where you know the answer. You genuinely know it. And choosing not to raise your hand, not because you're uncertain, but because offering the answer would briefly make you the point everyone is looking toward. And that cost feels higher than the cost of staying quiet. And sometimes it's even smaller than that. Someone calls your name across a crowded room loudly, and the heads turn, and something in you flinches before you've had a chance to think about it. Not because anything bad is coming, just because the convergence of attention itself is the thing that registered. The roots of this pattern are more varied than most people assume, and it's worth slowing down to look at them carefully. For some people, discomfort with attention developed in environments where standing out carried real risk. Maybe being noticed as a child was unpredictable. Sometimes it meant praise, and sometimes it meant criticism, and the inconsistency made visibility itself feel unsafe. When you can't reliably predict what attention will bring, the safest strategy is to minimize it, to stay small, to avoid giving anyone a clear target, and that strategy, practiced enough times in early environments, becomes automatic. For other people, the pattern has nothing to do with risk. It developed in households where humility was genuinely valued, where drawing attention to yourself was implicitly understood as immodest, where the culture of the family or community reinforced a preference for doing over announcing. These people didn't learn to fear attention. They learned to find it slightly distasteful, to associate the self-promotional instinct with something that doesn't quite fit with who they want to be. And for some, the discomfort is more sensory than emotional. They simply find the experience of being observed closely overstimulating. The convergent focus of multiple people's attention at once lands as genuine input overload, too much signal, too much to process and respond to simultaneously, and the impulse is to step back from it the way you'd step back from something loud. What these origins share is an outcome worth naming, a person who has developed a strong orientation toward other people's experience rather than their own. People who don't like being the center of attention tend to be unusually good at directing it. They ask questions that draw people out. They notice when someone on the edge of a conversation wants in and create the opening. They're the reason certain people feel heard after talking to them, not because of anything they said, but because of how completely they listened, how little they redirected toward themselves. This quality is genuinely rare. In most social environments, attention is a resource people compete for, consciously or not. The person who consistently gives it away, who makes space rather than taking it, creates something in their relationships that most people are hungry for without fully knowing it. And yet it comes with a cost that often goes unacknowledged. Because a life spent redirecting attention away from yourself is also, in some quiet way, a life where you are consistently less known than you might be. Where the full picture of who you are stays slightly out of reach, even for the people closest to you. Where you've been so practiced at turning the focus outward that turning it inward, letting someone actually look at you, receiving their attention without immediately doing something to disperse it, feels genuinely difficult. There's a deeper layer here that's worth sitting with, because for many people in this category, the discomfort with being seen isn't just about modesty or overstimulation. It's about something more precise. Being the center of attention means being evaluated. And being evaluated means that the version of you that's visible to others might not match the version of you that feels truest on the inside. There's a gap between the self that gets observed and the self that's actually being lived. And standing in the spotlight of other people's attention draws the focus directly to the surface version, the one you have the least control over, the one that gets interpreted without your input. For people who care deeply about being understood accurately, who have a finely tuned sense of the difference between how they come across and who they actually are, that loss of control is the real source of the discomfort. It's not the attention that's the problem. It's what attention does. It fixes you in place and lets other people form conclusions about you from the outside, and no amount of goodwill on their part makes that feel entirely safe. People who don't like being the center of attention often aren't avoiding people. They're prioritizing connection over performance. The goal was never to be seen less, it was to be seen accurately. And in a world where the spotlight rarely allows for nuance, stepping out of it can be the most honest thing available. So the next time you find yourself stepping out of the frame, deflecting the compliment, redirecting the story, finding a reason to move the focus somewhere that isn't you, it might not mean you're lacking in confidence or secretly hoping someone will push back. It might simply mean your mind is wired for connection over performance, for the kind of presence that makes other people feel central because you genuinely find them more interesting than the sound of your own name in a room. That's not a deficit, it's a specific way of valuing what social interaction is actually for. And the people who eventually learn to see you clearly, the ones you let stay long enough to look, tend to find that what was kept out of the light was worth far more than whatever you were deflecting toward. So now I'm curious, are you someone who tends to feel uncomfortable in the spotlight, who would rather listen than be talked about, who finds something quietly relieving about being out of focus? Or are you more the opposite, someone who feels energized when attention is on you, who comes alive in the center of a room? Drop it in the comments. And if there's a specific situation where the spotlight feeling hits hardest for you, birthdays, presentations, compliments, I'd genuinely like to know which one it is.